Hey there, I'm Nathan King. Today we're going to talk about how every speech is a story. Every great speech is a story. Why? Because every speaker has a story worth sharing. And we're going to talk about 7 elements of story, how they guide your audience to a place of connecting with your big goal, and how you'll help add value to their lives. Every speech really is a story, and every speaker has a story worth sharing. Stories are powerful. Man, for thousands of years, people have communicated using stories. In fact, for most of human history, oral tradition was the norm for transferring information. In fact, I don't know that I've ever met anyone who didn't like a story. Most people like stories. I'm sure there's exceptions out there. But you think about it, we consume stories in a variety of formats. There's film, TV, social media tells a story, advertising tells a story, even songs tell stories. You are exposed to thousands of messages every day, and many of them are stories. Well, a good talk is no different, because every great talk tells a great story. Every great talk tells a great story. And you know what? There's a lot of bad talks out there that don't do this. And we've all heard them. Every one of us have heard a bad talk that didn't connect through story. They're all about delivering information. Academic lectures, business presentations, political monologues, news reports, and probably even sermons at church. You've heard plenty of bad talks. We all have. A bad talk doesn't convince you to change anything. But a great talk can change someone's life. I think it's super important that we ace this, because we have a message worth sharing. You have a message worth sharing. And speaking merely for the sake of transferring information, it rarely leads to change. Speaking only to deliver information is actually a disservice to your audience. You know, if you desire to add value to your audience, it's because you want your words to change the world. So you have to deliver them in a way that encourages change. And story is your best opportunity for that. Why does story work? Well, story works because it builds empathy with an audience. Empathy and understanding are primary motivators for persuasion. Audiences won't just follow knowledge. Audiences follow competence and empathy, and a story demonstrates both. For example, take President Trump. He won the 2016 presidential race because he told a compelling story. Make America Great Again was his story. It is his story. And people who voted for him, whether they liked him or not, they voted for him because they believed in his story. And the ones who didn't vote for him, they didn't buy into his story. Not all stories will communicate to all people. Some do, and those are rare. But you have to acknowledge who your audience is, and you have to craft a story designed around the purpose of communicating empathy and understanding. Do that, and you'll have a story that works. I hope you choose to use story to format your next great talk. Why? Because you have a message worth sharing, and it would be a shame to waste it. Every good story guides the audience. Many communicators, they want to make the talk about them. That's a massive mistake. If you really want to communicate for change, you have to guide your audience through an exercise in examination. They have to examine 7 different things, and they're the elements of story that we're about to talk about. They're the status quo, the tension or problem, an opportunity for change, a decision that you need them to make or want them to make, how to implement that decision, the implementation steps, a resolution, and ultimately transformation. That's what you're trying to guide them to because you're trying to add value to their life. You want to change their life with your story. So part 1 of story is addressing the status quo. It's the accepted norm at the beginning of a story. It's where a character begins and what life looks like for them. Do you remember that movie, Remember the Titans? It's an amazing movie. In fact, it's my favorite sports movie. And this was straight off of IMDb's synopsis. It's the status quo. that's presented at the beginning of the movie, line for line, word for word. This is what that status quo of that movie is. Suburban Virginia schools have been segregated for generations. At the beginning of the film, segregation is the status quo. And then Coach Herman Boone comes along, and then we have the story of Remember the Titans. Such a great story. But the status quo is the situation that will change. It sets the audience and the story for what comes next. So part one is addressing the status quo. You're setting it up for part two, which is introducing tension. Introducing tension. You've got to introduce a problem into the story. If there was never any tension, the story would be dull, it would be boring, nobody would be interested. But you introduce a problem, and sometimes you define an existing problem. And then to really make it worthwhile, you have to highlight and agitate the problem, the need for change. How do we agitate any problem in a story we tell? Well, first of all, you have to present the external face of the problem. How does this problem affect life around you, or affect life around the audience or the people engaging with the talk? For example, and Remember the Titans, the external conflict was team conflict within the players themselves, and the cultural animosity experienced by Coach Boone and his family and staff and the players. And then, of course, there was the obvious external conflict of the football performance they experienced on and off the field. Not just an external problem, though. You need to also present and agitate an internal problem. Your story has to address this, and it answers this question: how does the problem affect you personally or your audience personally? Like mentally, emotionally, maybe spiritually. There's all these different aspects, but how does the problem affect you inside? And Remember the Titans, it's Coach Boone's, like, his own internal struggles and doubts about what's happening and whether or not it's worth it and all of that kind of stuff. And then finally, when we're agitating the problem and introducing this tension, we have to introduce a philosophical problem. Why is this problem worth addressing? For example, and Remember the Titans, going back to that again, the philosophical problem introduced by this movie is that racism is evil. Racism is evil. By succeeding, Coach Boone is going to prove that unity and equality is a better way to live. So the philosophical problem that gets introduced guides the audience to the bigger picture, the idea of right versus wrong, or overcoming something that's evil. And agitating the problem always highlights an uncomfortable tension. It compels the audience to find a solution you're going to be able to provide because you want to add value to their life. So part one was address the status quo. Part two is introduce the tension. Part three is embrace the opportunity. Like, what is the possibility for change? You got to define what's at stake. In other words, this is loss aversion. People are more likely to act if you tell them what they have to lose rather than if you tell them what they have to gain. It's why so much marketing and propaganda sounds like fear-mongering. But focusing only on the problem isn't a service to your audience, which is what a lot of that kind of communication is. Focusing only on the problem doesn't help anything. Providing solutions is where you add value. So you have to address what might life look like if the problem was solved. That's the opportunity you want your audience to embrace. But when you're introducing and embracing this opportunity, there's always two characters that come along with this. The first one is a villain. Like, who doesn't want the problem to be solved? The villain always wants to push everything in the story back to the status quo, and usually then some. In politics, it's easy to draw comparisons because if you think about the political nature of things and what you hear and see in that arena, in politics, the opposing party is always made to be the villain. Think about cable news for just a second. That's $1 billion industry because they've tapped into this principle. They always continually paint the other folks as villains. So in your story, there's always a villain, somebody who wants to go back to the status quo and then some. The second character that you introduce is someone who could help solve the problem. This is called a guide. And the guide has to have truth and empathy and competence in order to be able to help. The guide presents an invitation to a decision based on what they know. It's a call to action. And the call to action is what we see in the next part, which is part 4, where you call them to make a decision. What did you have to decide in order to change? What was the choice or the act that turned everything around? What kind of resistance did you face? The decision always costs something. You won't serve your audience if you bury the cost. Don't downplay it. If the decision is worth acting on, it will put them in direct opposition of the problem. And this is a climactic moment in any story. It's a turning point. For example, my favorite movie is the recent film Avengers Endgame. The climax of that film happens when it seems like all the heroes have been defeated, their base is destroyed. The big three that go out to fight the bad guy, they've all just been beat down. 2 of them are knocked out. They just got pummeled. And the only hero that's left is Captain America, my favorite. And he just got beat up. He's laying there, his shield is broke, and he has a decision to make. It's the climax of the film. Spoiler alert, he makes the decision to get up with his broken shield and to face an army all by himself. And everything in the story depends on that one moment before we see everything that comes after it. Your decision that you present to your audience, it dictates how the story ends. You're inviting them into this amazing story. So your decision you present, your audience dictates how their story will end, and everything depends on it. So make sure you ace this one. Part 5, immediately following the decision, is implementation. You want to implement action. This is a call to action, and it's the on-ramp for the decision. Like, what did the character have to do to actually change? If you're the character in the story, what did you go through? If it's somebody else, what did they go through? If you're presenting a principle or an opportunity in the business world or a sale or something like that, what does the person on the other side of the conversation have to do to implement what you're calling them to their decision? In other words, how do they live it out? How do they live out this decision in their world and in their life? Were there specific steps taken to change? If so, what were those steps? You have to be really, really clear with your implementation steps. Keep it simple. Provide a framework for change, giving the audience each step concisely. But move it all toward one call to action that's derived from the decision you mentioned earlier. You're answering this question. You made the decision. What are you going to do about it? And then you give them one very clear action to take. That one action might lead them to more down the road, but you have to start with just one action. Why? Research indicates audiences will routinely follow through with one action step. But the moment you introduce 2 or more, audience response plummets. It nosedives. So keep it simple. Introduce one clear, actionable step that your audience can implement based on their decision. And then part 6, experience resolution. What changed as the problem was solved? The resolution here, it has to mirror the opportunity from part 2. You have to define and redefine the stakes. You got to do it all over again. Like, what was gained instead of lost? How was the villain defeated? You address the tension and you answer those 3 problems that you agitated earlier. What changed in this situation externally or outside the main character? What changed internally? What were they going through mentally and emotionally, and how did they change there? And then also, what changed philosophically? How are things different in the world based on the call to action? That's an important thing to not gloss over. And this is strong, but it's true. If you can't offer real potential resolutions, you don't have a solution. You have wishful thinking that will not add value. And too many people have followed speakers who offer pie-in-the-sky resolutions. Look, it takes careful consideration and hard work to identify credible resolutions. So, do the work to come up with a resolution, a solution that your audience can experience that adds value. And then finally, part 7, you want to highlight the transformation. How was the resolution made obvious? Like, in this step, You're presenting a new version of normal that'll come about once your audience embraces the opportunity, makes the decision, implements the action, and experiences the resolution. Once they do all those things, they will be transformed. That's what you're presenting to them. And in a story-driven talk, the transformation is the foundation of your through line. Transformation is the guiding promise of what will happen. They start over here and they wind up over here completely changed. It's the new reality promised by the events of the story. And every great story ends with a transformation. And every great talk should too. It's called the hero's journey in classic literature. And as a communicator, you're helping your audience be a hero in their own journey. You're introducing them to solutions and principles that add value to their life. In other words, you're serving them. And every great communication adds value to the audience's life. Now, you're equipped to guide an audience through a great story with these 7 steps and these 7 principles. So spend some time thinking about these 7 elements of story. You're going to begin to notice them now that we've talked about them. You'll notice them in your favorite movies and books and TV shows and other things. And if you want to add value to your audience's life, walk them through these steps. Let's recap them really quickly. The status quo, the tension or the problem, the opportunity for change, a decision to make, implementation, resolution, and transformation. I want to challenge you. Take your favorite movie, your favorite book, think through these 7 elements and write them down. Think about how they work and how they connect. This one thing will begin to help you internalize these 7 elements of story, and it'll help you communicate your worthy message. Do this, internalize this, and you're going to be a better communicator. I guarantee. Thanks for watching.